Ladies and gentlemen, today I stand before you to shed light on a painful truth. What is happening in Israel and Palestine is not a new story. It is not a sudden conflict. It is not a spontaneous eruption of violence. It is the continuation of a long and deeply rooted history. A history of occupation, resistance, displacement, and injustice. When we turn on our televisions or scroll through social media and witness bombings, bloodshed, and suffering, we must remember this did not begin yesterday. It is the repetition of a historical pattern. The situation unfolding in Israel and Palestine today is not a random outbreak of violence or a modern-day anomaly. It is rooted deeply in a long, complex history that spans more than a century. The roots of this conflict trace back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, when political Zionism emerged and set the goal of establishing a Jewish homeland in historic Palestine. This region, already inhabited by a majority Arab population with a deep cultural, historical, and familial connection to the land, soon became the center of a collision between two national movements. What we see today is the direct result of that unresolved tension. The forced displacement did not start recently. It is the continuation of a strategy that has been gradually enforced through political declarations, military actions, and international silence. A pivotal moment in this historical trajectory occurred in 1948, during what Palestinians call the nakba, or catastrophe, when more than 700,000 Palestinians were violently expelled or forced to flee their homes during the creation of the State of Israel. Over 400 Palestinian villages were destroyed, and families were scattered across the region and beyond, turning a people into permanent refugees. That dramatic event set a precedent that has never truly been addressed or reconciled. The right of return for these displaced people has been consistently denied, while their ancestral lands were consecrated and repurposed. The decades that followed 1948 only deepened this historical wound. The Six-Day War of 1967 saw Israel occupying the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, territories that remain under varying degrees of Israeli control to this day. These occupations brought with them a wave of military checkpoints, settlement expansions, and curfews that turned daily life for Palestinians into a cycle of surveillance and restriction. Children born in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s have known nothing but occupation. They have grown up witnessing incursions, arrests, demolitions, and losses. From the first intifada to the second intifada, from Oslo to the present, the political processes have failed to bring justice or peace because they often ignore the deep historical context that fuels the anger and the cries for justice. To say this is nothing new is not to dismiss the urgency of the current moment, but to underscore the fact that this crisis cannot be separated from its historical roots. It is precisely because this cycle has repeated itself for generations that it becomes so morally urgent to address it with honesty and courage, Every round of violence, every rocket, every airstrike, every act of resistance or repression, all of it is a consequence of unresolved history. And until that history is acknowledged, until the original injustices are confronted, and until the dispossession that began decades ago is taken seriously, what is happening in Israel and Palestine will continue to repeat itself in different forms, but with the same devastating human cost. The dispossession of Palestinians is not a relic of the past, but a living, ongoing reality that continues to shape the lives of millions. Since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, countless Palestinian families have experienced the systematic loss of their homes, lands, and community. This process did not end with the initial displacement during the nakba. Rather, it has evolved and intensified through legal, political, and military mechanisms designed to uproot Palestinians from their ancestral lands. In both the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, home demolitions are a daily occurrence. Families are given little to no warning, and their homes are razed under the pretext of lacking permits. Permits that are nearly impossible for Palestinians to obtain under the current system. In the West Bank, particularly in areas designated as Area C, which is under full Israeli control, Palestinian villages are frequently denied access to basic infrastructure, water, and electricity. Meanwhile, Israeli settlements, built illegally under international law, expand rapidly in the same region, often receiving government subsidies and protection from the Israeli military. These settlements are more than just housing developments. They represent a systematic attempt to alter the demographics of the land and render a viable Palestinian state impossible. The expansion of settlements comes hand in hand with the confiscation of Palestinian farmland, roadblocks that restrict Palestinian movement, and violence from settlers that is rarely punished. In many cases, Palestinians are evicted from homes where their families have lived for generations. In East Jerusalem, Palestinian families face another form of dispossession, legal battles that aim to strip them of property through loopholes in Israeli law. Many of these families hold deeds to their homes dating back to the Ottoman Empire, yet face lawsuits from settler organizations claiming historical Jewish ownership. When the courts side with the settlers, as they often do, Palestinians are forcibly evicted and their homes are handed over. These evictions, which frequently spark international outrage, are part of a larger strategy to Judaize East Jerusalem and change its demographic composition. Meanwhile, in Gaza, where the Israeli blockade has created what many call the world's largest open-air prison, Palestinians are dispossessed not just of their homes, but of basic human dignity. Denied the right to travel freely, trade openly, or even rebuild after military assault. This continuous dispossession is psychological as well as physical. It sends a clear message to Palestinians. They are not wanted, they are not secure, and they have no guaranteed place on their own land. Generations have grown up watching their parents and grandparents fight endless legal battles, resist demolitions, or return from prison for the simple act of protesting their erasure. It is not just land that is being taken away. It is identity, heritage, and history. The loss is not just measured in dunams or houses, but in the dreams and futures stolen from a people who have been told again and again that they do not belong. This dispossession, relentless and systematic, is a central part of the ongoing struggle and must be recognized for the full truth of the crisis to come into view. The conflict between Israel and Palestine is marked by repeated and well-documented violations of international law, particularly by the Israeli state. These violations have not only been acknowledged by the Palestinian people and their advocates, but also by respected international organizations, legal experts, and human rights bodies. From the illegal expansion of settlements in occupied territories to the targeting of civilians in military operations, Israel has consistently acted in ways that contravene international conventions and United Nations resolutions. Yet, despite the clarity of the law and the mounting evidence, enforcement remains virtually non-existent, and accountability is almost always absent. This continued lack of consequences creates an environment where violations are normalized and expected, rather than punish or even seriously investigate. One of the most glaring violations is the construction and expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem areas that were occupied in 1967 and are considered occupied territories under international law. The Fourth Geneva Convention explicitly prohibits the transfer of an occupying power's civilian population into the territory it occupies. However, more than 700,000 Israeli settlers now live in these occupied regions. These settlements are connected by exclusive roads, protected by military forces, and often built on land confiscated from Palestinian owners. Entire Palestinian communities are displaced to make way for these developments, while their own ability to build or expand is severely restricted. The international community, including the United Nations, has repeatedly declared these settlements illegal, yet no meaningful action has been taken to halt or reverse the process. Another critical breach is the ongoing blockade of Gaza, which has been in place since 2007 and constitutes a form of collective punishment, also prohibited under international law. The blockade severely restricts the movement of people and goods in and out of Gaza, creating a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions. Access to clean water, electricity, healthcare, and education is deeply compromised. Over half the population is unemployed, and basic building materials are restricted, leaving entire neighborhoods in ruins after military operations. The siege has transformed Gaza into a densely populated area where over 2 million people live in conditions many human rights organizations describe as unlivable. The blockade is not just a policy, it is a prolonged act of punishment against an entire population for the actions of a few, and that stands in direct violation of international humanitarian principles. The use of disproportionate force in military operations is another deeply troubling issue that violates the laws of war. Numerous international reports have documented the targeting of civilian infrastructure in Gaza, including hospitals, schools, UN shelters, and residential buildings. Thousands of civilians, including women and children, have been killed in operations that Israel claims are aimed at neutralizing militant threats. While the presence of armed groups in densely populated areas complicates warfare, international law still demands that civilians be protected and that all feasible precautions be taken to minimize harm. In many cases, investigations have either been shelved or dismissed, and those responsible have faced no consequences. These actions further undermine the credibility of international legal frameworks and raise the question, what good are laws if they can be so openly ignored without consequence? The frequent calls for ceasefires in the Israel-Palestine conflict often create the illusion that peace is within reach. However, these ceasefires are typically temporary, fragile, and superficial. They serve more as pauses in violence than true efforts toward resolution. Once a ceasefire is declared, The world momentarily breathes a sigh of relief, media coverage slows, and global attention shifts elsewhere. But for the people living in Gaza, the West Bank, and within Israel, nothing fundamentally changes. The systems of oppression, occupation, and blockade remain firmly intact. The calm that follows a ceasefire is not peace. It is merely a lull before the next inevitable wave of destruction. Without addressing the root causes, every ceasefire becomes a reset button for a broken cycle. Each ceasefire is usually negotiated under pressure after widespread international outrage over civilian casualties, especially in Gaza. But the problem is that these ceasefires are rarely followed by any genuine political dialogue or structural change. The conditions that lead to violence, such as land dispossession, home demolitions, settlement expansions, military raids, and blockades, persist and often intensify. Palestinians are still subject to arbitrary arrests, checkpoints, restricted movement, and economic strangulation. Israel continues to maintain control over borders, airspace, and key resources. So, while rockets may stop flying and bombs may stop falling for a time, the daily violence of occupation and systemic injustice continues unabated, largely invisible to the outside world. Another issue with these ceasefires is that they are often negotiated without the inclusion of Palestinian voices in any meaningful or sovereign way. Ceasefires tend to be brokered by external powers, sometimes with opposing geopolitical interests, and they often reflect the desires of powerful states rather than the needs and rights of the people most affected. Palestinians are frequently treated not as agents of their own destiny, but as objects to be managed, appeased temporarily through humanitarian aid or shallow gestures, rather than engaged as equal participants in determining their future. The lack of agency in these processes reinforces the broader reality of Palestinian political exclusion, which itself is a major barrier to any lasting peace. Moreover, the cycle of violence and ceasefires has normalized a dangerously low standard for peace. When a ceasefire holds, it is often portrayed as a diplomatic success. Yet all it does is stop the shooting. It does not dismantle the occupation. It does not end the siege of Gaza. It does not provide justice for the dead or security for the living. The normalization of this repetitive cycle, it does not directly dismantle the international community and dulls the moral urgency required to demand real change. True peace cannot be measured by the absence of gunfire alone. It must be rooted in justice, freedom, equality, and dignity for all people. Without addressing the structural conditions of oppression, ceasefires become little more than bandages on a wound that continues to bleed beneath the surface. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the Israel-Palestine conflict is the nature of the power dynamics involved. Mainstream narratives, especially in global media, often portray the situation as a symmetrical struggle between two equal forces locked in a perpetual feud. This framing distorts the reality on the ground and obscures the profound imbalance that exists between a militarily dominant state and an occupied, largely defenseless population. Israel possesses one of the most advanced military forces in the world, equipped with cutting-edge technology, a strong intelligence network, air superiority, and nuclear weapons. Its military is supported by billions of dollars in foreign aid, primarily from the United States, and it operates with little accountability. In contrast, the Palestinians lack a conventional army, an air force, or even sovereign control over their borders. They are a stateless people, fragmented by checkpoints, blockades, and occupation forces. struggling to assert their basic rights. The disparity in power is not limited to the military realm. It extends to legal, political, and diplomatic arenas as well. Israel is a recognized state with defined borders, the ability to form international alliances, and the privilege of participating in global institutions. It exercises full control over its laws, its resources, and its security. The Palestinian Authority, though nominally in charge of certain areas in the West Bank, functions under heavy Israeli oversight and lacks real autonomy. In Gaza, Hamas holds de facto power but operates under crippling blockade conditions, unable to provide adequate services or protection for the population. The power to make life-altering decisions such as who can move, who gets access to water, or whose house gets demolished almost always rests with Israel. This imbalance defines the daily realities of Palestinians and renders the term conflict misleading, as it suggests parity where none exists. Even in terms of media representation and global narrative control, the imbalance is evident. Israel enjoys a well-resourced public relations strategy and a sympathetic platform in many Western governments and media outlets. Palestinian voices, on the other hand, are often marginalized, criminalized, or dismissed as extremist. When violence erupts, Palestinian resistance is quickly labeled as terrorism, while state violence by Israel is framed as defense. This discrepancy in how the world perceives and reports the situation contributes to the imbalance of power, allowing Israel to continue its policies with minimal international backlash. Furthermore, the consequences for Palestinians who speak out, be they journalists, activists, or even children, are severe. Arrests, censorship, and even killings are common outcomes for those who dare to challenge dominant narrative. Acknowledging the imbalance of power is essential to understanding why the cycle of violence persists and why peace remains elusive. When one side possesses overwhelming control militarily, economically, and politically, and uses that control to suppress the rights of another people, there can be no true negotiation, no genuine dialogue, and no fair solution. The pretense of equal footing masks the reality of domination until the international community recognizes and addresses this deep disparity. Peace initiatives will be built on a foundation of false equivalence. The human cost of the Israel-Palestine conflict is devastating and deeply entrenched in every aspect of daily life for Palestinians. Especially in the Gaza Strip and occupied West Bank, for many, life is defined by checkpoints, curfews, military incursions, and the looming threat of violence. The psychological toll on the population particularly on children, is immense. Studies and reports by international health organizations have documented soaring rates of PTSD, anxiety, and depression among Palestinian youth. Growing up surrounded by destruction, imprisonment, and the sound of drones and gunfire has become a tragic norm. For these children, trauma is not an occasional event. It is a constant state of being. They are forced to mature in environments where safety and stability are non-existent. In Gaza, the humanitarian situation has reached catastrophic levels. The 17-year-long blockade has created a scenario where over 2 million people live in what many describe as an open-air prison. Access to clean drinking water is limited, electricity is sporadic, and hospitals are frequently overwhelmed and undersupplied. Medical equipment is scarce, and even cancer patients have been denied permission to travel for treatment. With each Israeli military assault, whether in 2008, 2014, or the most recent bombardments, entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble. Schools and hospitals have been hit, and civilian infrastructure has collapsed. These are not just statistics. They represent human beings. The suffering also extends to Palestinians living under occupation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Frequent night raids, arbitrary arrests, and administrative detentions without trial are common occurrences. Families often live in fear that a loved one, sometimes a teenager, could be taken away in the middle of the night by armed forces. Entire villages face the threat of eviction, demolition, or settler attacks. Meanwhile, Israeli settlers, often heavily armed and protected by the military, act with near impunity, terrorizing Palestinian communities and seizing land. The justice system offers little recourse for Palestinians who are tried in military courts where conviction rates are staggeringly high. The daily humiliation, fear, and loss that accompany life under occupation are forms of violence that leave scars no less deep than physical wounds. Even those Palestinians who live inside the recognized borders of Israel face systemic discrimination in housing, education, employment, and political representation. They are often treated as second-class citizens in a state that defines itself primarily by its Jewish identity. Many live in unrecognized villages without access to basic services, while others suffer from discriminatory zoning laws and unequal allocation of resources. The cumulative effect of these layers of suffering, whether through blockade, occupation, or discrimination, is the dehumanization of an entire people. It is not just the buildings that are destroyed in this conflict, but lives, communities, and generations. The human cost is vast, and it continues to mount with every passing day of inaction, indifference, and injustice. In the midst of overwhelming propaganda, selective reporting, and political spin, the most urgent need in the Israel-Palestine conflict is the recognition of truth. For decades, Palestinian voices have been sidelined, dismissed, or silenced, making it difficult for the world to see the full reality of their struggle. The truth is not always convenient or comfortable, especially for powerful states that support the status quo. But without truth, there can be no justice. Acknowledging the historical injustices from the nakba in 1948 to the ongoing occupation is essential for building any meaningful foundation for peace. This means listening to the lived experiences of Palestinians, recognizing their pain, and accepting the factual record of displacement, dispossession, and systemic violence they have endured. Justice is not about choosing sides arbitrarily. It is about standing with the oppressed and upholding international standards of human rights. The Palestinian demand for justice is not rooted in revenge. It is rooted in dignity, equality, and the right to live freely in their own homeland. They are asking for what any people would ask: the right to live without fear, to move without restriction, to speak without being imprisoned, and to exist without being imprisoned, and to exist without being erased. Justice for Palestinians means holding those who have violated international law accountable. It means ending the occupation, lifting the blockade, halting illegal settlements, and restoring the rights of refugees who have been denied return for generations. These are not radical demands. They are human ones, backed by law, principle, and morality. Truth and justice must also go hand in hand with moral courage. Too often, world leaders, institutions, and even prominent voices in media shy away from speaking openly about Israel's actions for fear of political backlash or controversy. But silence in the face of oppression is not neutrality, it is complicity. Speaking out against injustice should not be mistaken for hatred. Rather, it is an expression of humanity. Those who claim to care about peace must be willing to confront uncomfortable truths and challenge dominant narratives. It is through this moral clarity that change becomes possible. The more the truth is suppressed, the more distorted the path to justice becomes. In contrast, truth clears the way for reconciliation, recognition, and eventual healing. What is happening in Palestine is not a conflict between equals. It is a case of systemic oppression and colonization. Until the international community is willing to address this imbalance with integrity, justice will remain out of reach. Palestinians are not asking for special treatment. They are demanding what the world promises in its laws, charters, and declaration. Freedom, justice, and self-determination. Upholding these ideals is not just a Palestinian issue, it is a global moral responsibility. The pursuit of truth and justice in Palestine is a test of our collective conscience. It challenges us to ask, will we allow lies, fear, and power politics to continue shaping the future? Or will we finally insist on a just and truthful resolution to one of the most prolonged and painful struggles of our time? In the face of decades of suffering, displacement, and resistance, the call for justice in Palestine remains as urgent as ever. The world cannot afford to look away or remain silent while violations of human rights and international law continue unchecked. True peace will never be achieved through temporary truces or skewed negotiations. It can only come through a genuine reckoning with history, a dismantling of systems of oppression, and a firm global commitment to equality and dignity for all. What is happening in Israel and Palestine is not new, but our response to it can be. This moment demands awareness, action, and the courage to speak the truth, even when it is inconvenient, because justice delayed is justice denied, and the time for justice is now.